Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jeremy Collins. I'm the Director of Conferences and Symposia here at the National World War II Museum's Jenny Craig Institute for the Study of War and Democracy. It's my pleasure to be a part of this program today that's going to be ably chaired by my friend and colleague, Dr. Jason Dawsey. Jason is our research historian here at the Institute and is responsible for many of the articles and webinars that I'm sure many of you have enjoyed that you've seen on our website and our YouTube page. He's also been involved in our historical research services program that helps family members find out what their loved ones did during the war. He's a professor with our ASU partnered program, and he's just sort of a jack of all trades and a master of many. He received his PhD from the University of Chicago, and it's my pleasure to turn the program over to Jason. Jason?
Jeremy, thank you very much. I want to welcome everyone viewing this webinar. We appreciate your time and your interest in this very important subject. Obviously, today we're going to be discussing the German invasion and occupation of Ukraine during World War II. This is a subject that's been in the news, obviously, a great deal in the last several months with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where the history and memory of World War II on the Eastern Front has played such a major role for the Russian government and its justification for the war. The Ukrainian government, in response, has also mobilized the history and memory of World War II to counter, in fact, the Russian claims. So I think it's important for us to do something where we throw some light on the actual history of World War II in Ukraine. It's also a very timely moment to do such. When we're recording this, Wednesday, August 24th, 2022, it is Ukrainian Independence Day. And yesterday, August 23rd, was the beginning of the Battle of Stalingrad, the 80th anniversary of that, this decisive battle in World War II. And so it's a great time to actually go back and reconsider this history, focusing on Ukraine and see what we can really learn from it, aside from how it's being utilized by particular governments. To do that, I'm delighted to have a conversation today with two dear friends and colleagues, Dr. Jennifer Popowitz and Dr. Jan Mann, and I'm going to introduce both of them right here, and then we're going to get right into our discussion about the German invasion and occupation of Ukraine during World War II. So let me start with Dr. Popowitz. She is the Leventhal Postdoctoral Research Fellow at the National World War II Museum, a colleague with me here in the museum's Institute for the Study of War and Democracy. She received her PhD from Louisiana State University in 2021 and specializes in Eastern Europe during World War II. Her research focuses on Nazi occupation policies in Ukraine, the Holocaust by bullets, forced labor, and post-war migrations and displacements. She has presented her research at conferences in the United States, in Poland, and in Ukraine, and is currently working on a book manuscript entitled Ukrainian Nationalisms, Total War and the Utilization of National Identity, 1939 to 1953. Also joining us is Dr. Jan Mann. Dr. Mann is Clinical Assistant Professor of History and the Program Lead of the World War II Studies Master's Degree Program at Arizona State University. That's a partnership with us here at the National World War II Museum. We're a partnership we're thrilled about, and we hope you will do some digging about this master's degree program if you're really interested in the history of World War II. He was born in Chernovtsi, Ukraine, and after spending a year in Moscow doing research on a Fulbright grant, he received his doctorate at Arizona State University. He is the author of Situating Stalin in the History of the Second World War, in the edited volume titled The Memory of the Second World War in Soviet and Post-Soviet Russia, that appeared with Routledge, and the forthcoming Manufactured Memory, Crafting the Cult of the Great Patriotic War, in the edited volume Terror Times, Terrorscapes, Continuities of Space, Time, and Memory in 20th Century War and Genocide. That will come out with Purdue University Press. His research revolves around the relationship between individual and collective memory of the Great patriotic war, the Stalin cult, censorship, propaganda, and the production of the war's first official history during Khrushchev's thaw. He specializes in the Second World War, the Soviet Union, and war and society. Jen and Jan, welcome. It's great to see you both.
Thank you.
So I thought we would just jump right in, and obviously this has been something we've been talking about for some months now, about doing a webinar on this crucial topic. And there's always the issue about the point of departure. Where do you start? So where I would like to start is with Jen and asking about Nazi planning for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union launched in June 1941. And so with that, Jen, can you tell us about the strategic significance of Ukraine in Nazi thinking as they prepared for this massive assault on the USSR?
Yeah, sure. And thank you for that great introduction, Jason. Really looking forward to talking about Ukraine during World War II today. So Hitler outlined his aims for forming a vast European empire in his autobiographical manifesto Mein Kampf, which was first published in 1925. And in it, he described his intentions to use the region to provide ethnic Germans with additional Lebensraum, or living space. And this was based on the notion that Germans needed additional territory or living space to ensure their survival of the Aryan race. The region also held the promise of creating a rural Germanic lifestyle that Nazi ideology glorified. The long-term Nazi general plan for the East involved seizing Eastern Europe, the consolidation of borders in the Reich's Eastern Empire, and the eventual elimination of the region's native inhabitants. It also included the vast migration of ethnic Germans to Eastern Europe to live in a neo-feudal systems of farms and model villages, kind of ranging from the Reich to Leningrad all the way down to Crimea. Ukraine, as many people are familiar, is often considered the breadbasket of Europe, has very rich, fertile soil, especially in the Black Sea region. And Ukraine was specifically reserved for an estimated 20 million German colonists that would gradually outnumber the local inhabitants until the country became, and this is like in Hitler's words, one of the loveliest gardens in the world. Related to Nazi colonial plans was Nazi racial ideology, which regarded Slavs as Untermenschen, or subhumans, or as some people have translated, despised and intrinsically inferior race. So that's just like a little background on the thinking of Ukraine in Hitler's mind. But as you mentioned, as we get closer to Operation Barbarossa, Ukraine takes on a more strategic and particularly economic significance. So between 1933 and 1939, Germany was very focused on rearmament and military spending, in addition to the politicalization of foreign trade, which left Germany paying substantial agricultural premiums to foreign nations in exchange for loyalty to the Reich. So even before the war started, Germany was importing most of its food. And according to preliminary German reports, and these were conducted in summer of 1940, before even like the planning of Operation Barbarossa started, Germans found, or they estimated, that Ukraine produced 40 million tons of grain annually, which amounted to about 40% of the entire Soviet Union's harvest of 100 million tons of grain. And as a result, German economic strategists planned to allocate 30 million tons of Ukrainian produced grain to German soldiers and civilians, despite the fact that this would result in the mass starvation of millions of Ukrainians. Another report, also conducted in the summer of 1940, also demonstrated Ukraine's industrial capacity, estimating that Ukraine contributed 70% of the USSR's total production of sugar, 60% of its iron, 54% of coal, and 25% of its machinery. So as a result, the immediate economic plans for Ukraine during the war prioritized the requisition of food, raw materials, and industrial equipment from the region, as well as the maintenance of collective farms and the use of the local Ukrainian population to harvest food for German soldiers and civilians.
Well, Jen, you've definitely given us a lot of information there that points to a couple of things, that this was no kind of ordinary war that the Nazis imagined in Ukraine. And this is even just leaving out the other areas of the Soviet Union that were targeted. But what the Nazis envisioned in Ukraine was a war of subjugation, exploitation, colonization, and mass annihilation. That this was going to be a catastrophic war for the inhabitants of Ukraine, and going to be a place where Nazi Germany could count on a food supply and count on a kind of completely repopulating the area with ethnic Germans. And these are all things we'll be able to say more about, and about what was going to happen to the inhabitants of the country in the process. So Jan, I want to turn to you in that, as we actually launch Operation Barbarossa on June 22nd, 1941, it's German Army Group South that's focused on Ukraine. It will have allies. We'll mention at least one of those non-German allies shortly. But I think for a lot of people who are familiar with the military aspect of this, what they always think about are these major defeats that the Red Army suffers in German hands in this region in the opening months of this war. Could you tell us about these major defeats suffered by the Soviets in Ukraine in 1941?
Yeah, absolutely. So I kind of want to divide this into two, and that is somewhat moving west to east. So initially, I really want to mention what happens in the German rear as they are advancing, and then shift focus to the Soviet Red Army and their experiences. And so it's interesting to go off of what Jen has previously said, in that some of these ideas that comes to the Third Reich, to Hitler, are well enough known because they're published. And yet that does not stop various nationalist organizations from trying to work, cooperate, collaborate with the Germans in the hope of eventually achieving some type of independence. And in part, you do see that very much with Ukrainian nationalists. And we have to keep in mind that there is some precedent for them to work off of, and that is what happens with Slovakia and Croatia, that there is some independence that was offered to both. And so they're hoping the same can be, again, done with them after the German invasion. And so, as you mentioned, the German invasion of the Soviet Union features a variety of allied forces that grew in number over time. But importantly for our discussion are, at the very least, two battalion-sized units made up of nationalist Ukrainians that are officered by the Germans that come in the wake of the invasion. And you also, at the same time, both in the pre-war period and in the follow-up to the invasion, have a variety of nationalist elements trying to sneak over the border or eventually cross the border. And they are helping the German invasion by serving as translators, by serving as spies, and obviously soldiers and collaborators. And so the Germans, in part, are made aware of Soviet positions, Soviet units, their dispositions, but also when it comes to what eventually we call the Holocaust by bullets, is they create lists of locals who the Germans would need to eventually target for their genocidal campaign. And so one of the more important things that happens in practically the immediate aftermath of the invasion is the launching of various pogroms throughout Western Ukraine. One of the most famous takes place in Lvov or Lviv, right? One of the main reasons for the breakout of this pogrom is a result of the Red Army retreating. On the ground, local NKVD forces either took it on their own initiative or from orders received above to kill any and all political prisoners being held in jails throughout Western Ukraine. And as a result, thousands are executed. Now, who do the locals blame? Because we are talking about their relatives, their friends that they are now finding the bodies of once the Red Army and the NKVD and all aspects of Soviet society in terms of government infrastructure have retreated, right? They blame the Soviet regime, but more specifically, because of the rhetoric that was utilized by nationalists, which they relied on the Third Reich for the most part, is matching Nazi propaganda, and that is Jews are communists, right? This idea of a Judeo-Bolshevik organization that exists in the Soviet Union, this is now who we begin to target as revenge for these executions. Other ideas come into play as well. Not everyone is an ideologue, understandably. Economics plays a role, but the result is the same throughout Western Ukraine. And that is with little support or encouragement by the Germans or from the Germans, but very much with their encouragement and permission, you have local populations rise up and start to torture, humiliate, rape, rob, and often kill Jewish men, women, children, elderly. There really is no difference. At the same time, you have Einsatzgruppen that are following the German armed forces, and they are initiating the more systematic mass murder of Jewish populations throughout Western Ukraine. And so the number of pogroms, if we look at them, and this is only kind of in the summer months, this is the beginning, but it already tells us something about what this war is going to look like. You have a low of 58 to as many as 140 pogroms begin to take place in the first, I think, month of July. Victims range from as low as 13,000 to 39,000. The next month, if those figures were not bad enough, for August, you have 61 to 62,000. And by September, 136 to 137,000. Right, so this victimization and annihilation of the Jewish population serves also as an attraction for the locals from neighboring cities, towns, and villages, and they come with carts for the purposes of plunder, right? You cannot escape the economic element because to a large extent, we are dealing with a population that is not awash in material objects. And so what they can get, they will. And eyewitnesses recall that those perpetrators included all types of people from society: teachers, judges, pharmacists, school inspectors, priests, students, peasants, women, pretty much anyone and everyone that you could think of that you could encounter on a daily basis. And so, interestingly enough, Eastern Ukraine does not experience the same type of actions. And that in part comes back to the fact that Western Ukraine has only been incorporated into the Soviet Union for probably less than 2 years at this point. And so what Eastern Ukraine was exposed to, the Russification, Sovietization, etc., that has not necessarily taken place in the West. And obviously, when thinking about the evolution of the Holocaust, one of the most significant and infamous events that stands out is the mass execution of Jews at Babi Yar outside of Kiev in September. And that is in a mere 2 days, you have 33,771 Jewish men, women, and children executed. And this is done in retaliation for delayed action mines that were set by Soviet Red Army troops and then detonated after their retreat. So again, who do they target? The face of the Soviet regime, so to speak, and that is any and all Jews that they can find. Important, during the Holocaust, you have 1.6 million Ukrainian Jews killed, right, as best in terms of estimates. So that is all happening in the rear. What's happening on the front lines? So Stalin understands the value of Ukraine, of Ukrainian territory, the amount of resources that it contains. And you have the largest concentration of Soviet armor located there. This also means that some of the largest armored battles take place in Ukraine. Obviously not to the success of the Soviet Union, but they do hold up the German invasion in part because there's only one panzer group operating with Army Group South. And so there are running battles from the border into the Soviet interior. There is a few successful initial encirclements, one of the largest being at Uman, but eventually what comes to represent the largest encirclement on the Eastern Front takes place outside of Kiev. And it's still a question about why the Red Army does not abandon their positions, because they know what's coming, they can see what's coming. One theory is that Stalin was due to meet with the Allies quite soon, and he did not want to come to them saying that we had just lost the capital of Ukraine. That is not necessarily a position of strength that he would be operating from when making requests and demands of the Allies to help with the war. And so keeping in mind what's happening on other parts of the front, in Army Group Center, they have just committed 2 major encirclements, but they are somewhat frozen at this point in time. And the reason that the Kiev encirclement is allowed to take place in some ways is thanks to Guderian and his panzer crew being rerouted to the south and helping with this encirclement. This was an encirclement of opportunity, because pretty much immediately they are then rerouted back for Operation Typhoon, which is the advance on Moscow. And Guderian and his army group are eventually stuck outside of Tula, trying to encircle the Soviet capital. So the Red Army experiences quite a few defeats throughout 1941 in the South, but there are these instances, glimpses of success, one of which is the Defense of Adiesa, right? With Adiesa, a part of that is because Romanian forces are operating against the Red Army. And so Soviet opposition, for numerous reasons, is somewhat better than it is in other places along the front. However, because the front lines have moved on far beyond Odessa, and there is no real hope for relief, eventually defenders are ferried out to Sevastopol, right? They are relocated to the Crimea, and the city is given up. The Jewish population and others eventually suffer under Axis rule for the rest of the war until liberation. I'd also make quick mention of Kharkiv. That's the only city I want to say that changed hands 3 times throughout the war. So it was utterly devastated by the time of its final liberation. But in general, I'll say Red Army actions throughout Ukraine did not differ so much from what was seen in the Baltics or Belarusia. Granted, the advance through Belarusia was quite quick compared to the South, again, because 2 panzer groups were operating in Army Group Center. But the German forces that do sweep through Ukraine, they leave in their wake the beginning or the progression of this Holocaust by bullets. They are very much instrumental in what happens in Ukraine. We've got what's happening in the rear in terms of Ukrainian nationalists and Einsatzgruppen, but the German armies are also participating in this. And this is eventually, these armies, these commanders, these soldiers are what eventually make up the spear point for the advance on Stalingrad and the Caucasus in the spring and summer of 42, and what we see develop there. Right.
Thank you, Jan. You've really, after Jen's answer, Jen talking about what was envisioned for Ukraine, really helped to fill in the gap some about just how murderous this war is in Ukraine. And there is, just for our viewers out there, much more to say about that, for sure. And also about how that's completely interconnected to these defeats that the Soviets suffer in these opening months, but they're also not done for at all in Ukraine and elsewhere. That we'll have a lot to say about how the Soviets will respond and gather momentum themselves as we get near the end of this. But we should say something here, Jen, about what the Germans do with these initial successes in Ukraine. And this really takes us to the enormous question about German occupation policy in Ukraine. So could you take us through what characterizes this occupation policy?
Yes, definitely. I mean, as I mentioned before, Nazi occupation policy in Ukraine was combining Hitler's colonial aims in Eastern Europe, Nazi racial ideology, and obviously economic necessity. And it probably took, I mean, depending on, how far east you go, it took a couple months before there was an effective civilian administration set up in Ukraine. And I think Jan just provided a great description of what was going on before that civilian administration was set up. And I could probably spend days talking about Nazi occupation policy, but I'm only going to focus on 3 areas today. So I'm going to talk about requisitioning, mass starvation, and forced labor, because I think those were probably the 3 most detrimental to the Ukrainian civilians. So we'll start with requisitioning. During the initial invasion and then after the civil administration was set up, the Wehrmacht operated on the assumption that any food, resources, and equipment found in the region were to be placed at the disposal of the German army. For example, all raw materials, semi-manufactured and finished goods were to be withdrawn. Platinum, magnesium, and rubber were to be collected and immediately shipped back to Germany. However, when it became obvious that the attack on the Soviet Union was going to take longer than anticipated, the more food, clothing, and equipment Nazis seized from the local population. So as early as September 16th, we had German orders for troops to live off the land and to feed themselves, which in practice translated to a direct approval of uncontrolled pillaging and looting. And as a result, Germans started searching entire villages, confiscating everything they could make use of. And I think the major turning point is when winter sets in. The German army and then also the civilian administration were not equipped with any kind of winter gear because they had been expecting a short war in the East, and they were very unprepared for winter in Russia. So all privately owned houses had to turn over to Nazi administrators any warm or manufactured things like coats, boots, socks, padded jackets, blankets, fur hats. Everything had to be turned over to the Germans. And the civil administration actually established quotas for each town for all these items to be requisitioned. And Nazi officials went from house to house, taking all warm clothing away from Ukrainians. And during these home searches, Germans often took anything of value as well. So Ukrainians were forced to turn over non-essential items, such as like books, maps, and paintings. And the pillaging of towns and villages continued to take on a more violent form as the war progressed and increasingly involved civilians being shot, homes being burned, and in some cases, entire villages burned to the ground when Ukrainians could not meet any of these quotas set by the Germans. Another horrific aspect of German occupation policy is what some historians refer to as the hunger plan. As I mentioned previously, Nazi economic planners believed that Ukraine, being the breadbasket of the world, could cure Germany of all its agricultural problems, despite the fact that they recognized that this would lead to the mass starvation of millions of Ukrainians. During occupation, agricultural policy revolved around the principle that grain from Ukraine was to be allocated first to German soldiers, then to Germans in Germany, then to Ukrainian civilians, and finally to Soviet POWs. This policy was emphasized by the commander of the 6th Army, Field Marshal von Reichenau, and he told soldiers to imagine that any food that entered the mouth of a Soviet citizen was being taken from the mouth of a German child, which is just a very graphic way to convince or to implement a starvation plan. And the greatest effect of this starvation policy in Ukraine was seen in large cities and within POW camps. And in both cases, the war food rations were gradually reduced to almost nothing. And I'm just going to throw out a couple statistics. I don't want to like bore everyone with tons of statistics, but just a couple examples to demonstrate like how little food people in the cities were actually receiving. So the weekly rate for non-workers in Kyiv during the winter of 1941-1942 was 400 grams of bread. And that literally equals less than half a loaf. Initially, peasants from the countryside were allowed to come into the city to sell their harvests at markets. But from July 1942 and onward, Nazi officials banned local markets and prohibited food from entering large cities. And the effect of the starvation policy was completely devastating. And it's hard to come up with an exact number of the number of people that died from starvation. But some historians estimate that in the city of Kyiv between April 1942 and the middle of 1943, close to 57,000 people died of starvation. And the situation was similar in smaller towns and villages. You have decrees issued in Western Ukraine in October 1941, which set the bread ration rate to 200 grams per day for Ukrainians and 150 grams a day for Jews. So that's basically like a slice of bread. The decree also banned the sale of milk, oil, butter, and eggs. All that had to go to Nazi officials. And in May 1942, bread rations declined to 150 grams of bread for adults and 75 grams for children under the age of 10. Additionally, all farmland in town had to be registered with the Germans in order to receive more grain for Germans to be sent to Germany, which also limited the amount of grain that Ukrainians received. And by the end of 1942, all families were strictly forbidden to consume products using flour. Flour was solely reserved for Germans. But by far, prisoners of war suffered the most from Nazi starvation policies. During their sentences in camps, POWs were systematically starved to death, receiving on average only half a liter of some kind of soup that was usually made out of rotten potatoes. Sometimes they received a loaf of bread that had to be shared among tens of prisoners. And it's estimated that 3 million Soviet POWs died from this deliberate starvation policy. And some historians have said that it was genocidal in intent and consequences. But many German officers or officials believe that the more prisoners that die, the less people we have to feed and more food for German soldiers and Germans living back home. And so the third kind of occupation policy that I want to talk about is forced labor. Plans for the exploitation of Ukrainian labor were based on labor policies that had been enacted during the Nazi occupation of Poland between 1939 and 1941, which relied on compulsory labor registration and volunteers to go work in Germany for 3 to 6 months. And in 1941, those initial labor requirements, registering with the German Labor Front and asking for volunteers to go to Germany to work for 6 months stay, that continued. But around March 1942, due to some setbacks on the Eastern Front, a new labor policy was devised that relied on compulsory labor conscription for all Eastern occupied territories. So like this happened in Ukraine, but it was also all the rest of occupied Eastern Europe. And the Germans created commissions to conduct deportations. They set quotas for the number of foreign laborers that needed to be like, quote, recruited to work in Germany. Quotas for Ukraine were especially high, demanding 250,000 workers in the last 3 months of 1942, and then another 250,000 by April 1943. And in order to successfully fulfill these number of quotas, it's estimated that 3,000 Ukrainians were apprehended every day in large cities, and that number increased to 6,000 2 months later. And as the persistent war with the Soviet Union demanded an increase in manufacturing and armaments production, this led to like an increase in the use of force for assigning and collecting people for deportation to Germany. In many places, it kind of equaled like a massive manhunt. People were picked up off the streets, out of their homes. Schools were raided. If you were at the market or a movie theater, those were raided as well. And similar to refusal to hand over supplies to German soldiers if villages did not provide the number of people requested, reprisals were taken out, people were shot, or entire villages were also burned to the ground. So pretty devastating.
Yes, I don't think there's any better word than devastating. It's a savagely brutal occupation. But we should note here that when we're talking about the Third Reich's war in Ukraine, that it gets help. It has help from other countries. And I think it would be important here to note one especially significant ally of the Nazi regime here, and that's Romania. And this is really a question for both of you. We'll start with Jan on this one. Could both of you provide some background about Romanian participation in the invasion and occupation of Ukraine?
Yeah, I'll add very quickly the number I came across when it comes to forced labor from Ukraine for Germany was 2.5 million Ukrainians in total, which quite a significant amount. And again, not all of them voluntarily, but undoubtedly this also eased the issue of food in Ukraine as an alternative kind of point of view, which both sides could benefit from. So when it comes to Romania and the invasion of Ukraine, the occupation of areas in Ukraine, so the decision to reconquer these previously lost Romanian territories was made at the highest levels of Romanian leadership. The two specific areas that I'll concentrate on for the moment, even though Romanian forces were found in more than just them, are Bessarabia and Bukovina. And the city that I'm from, Cenovce, is located in Bukovina. So about 277,000 Jews lived in both of those provinces. And as the Romanians invaded the Soviet Union alongside the Germans, they began to unleash indiscriminate violence on the local population in both provinces. Approximately 45,000 to 60,000 Jews perished under Romanian rule in the summer of 41. And in the fall, close to 150,000 were deported to the southeastern region of Ukraine, where they were placed in ghettos and concentration camps. Romanian troops well remembered the retreat that they made from the Red Army in the summer of 1940, and the perceived role played by Jews who demonstrated their support for the Soviets. So similar to Ukrainian nationalists and other locals, honestly, throughout Eastern Europe, they associated the Soviet regime with Jews. So Romanian military forces participated in this indiscriminate killing of Jews as they accused them of attacking Romanian troops, quite similar to German accusations elsewhere on the Eastern Front. Right? This followed this very general idea that not all partisans were Jews, but all Jews were partisans. The majority of the killing was done by specially created death squads. And that's somewhat similar to what the Germans do, but there is a bit of a difference. These death squads are composed of non-commissioned officers, volunteer soldiers, and if that was not enough, they would appoint soldiers by their superiors to these squads. And they were ordered to cleanse the localities of Jews and communists, killing everyone from infants to old men. Additionally, military police units who were tasked with preserving order in the rural areas of the country were also entrusted with eliminating perceived enemies. But it's one thing to have these orders being issued, the other is carrying them out on the ground. And so this is where there's some differences that could be pointed to, which existed, again, on the ground level. And a lot of power was given to those commanders who found themselves specifically in these cities, towns, villages, as well as military police units. And so those in Bessarabia, to some extent, held themselves to a higher standard of eliminating Jews, while those in Bukovina, not as much. And it really depended on those in charge, some of whom had relations with Jews or were just not as anti-Semitic as others. And power was diffused even further, right, to those under their control. And so this is where their conscience really dictated the actions on the ground. And it could very much vary from one local commander to another. And so this created this space where sometimes Jews were executed, but in other instances, they were just detained and deported, right? So that's a bit of an overview of what was happening in these specific territories. Coming to my grandparents' experiences, this is on my father's side. Both my grandfather and my grandmother survived the war in the Mogilov-Podolsk ghetto. My grandmother did not discuss her experiences. My grandfather shared some of his, and he also had them written up in a few places. So those that he shared in a general sense is his recollection about the occupation of his town. And there he witnessed how houses and apartments were looted by local Ukrainians. Jews were put to work in forced labor in terms of building bridges or flattening the earth for an airfield. This was in the summer. They were given no food or water while performing this forced labor. He saw Jews from Bessarabia and Bukovina that were herded through Mogilov-Podolsk by the Romanians across the Dniester. He witnessed how many of them perished due to cold, hunger, and typhus. And he himself at one point suffered from typhus. 6 of his relatives, my extended family, were killed during the occupation, some after being deported to the concentration camp Pichora. And he barely survived with his mother as they attempted to avoid starvation by living off of gruel made from corn flour. And this very much reinforces Jen's discussion about these occupation policies. And this is not only the Germans, right? This is Romanians as well. And eventually, Mogilov-Podolsk was liberated on March 19th, 1944, by tank forces from the Red Army. And I'll recount one episode that he told me about this post-liberation experience, which is one of his friends. And keep in mind, my grandfather is about 13 years old, born in 1930. So he's about 13, 14 years old at this point in time. One of his friends was in the militia, carried around a rifle at this point in time. And as they were coming out onto the streets to see the liberation of their town, they saw a local Ukrainian collaborator who was part of what they called Politsai, who regularly abused, tortured Jews in the ghetto. They came up to a Red Army officer, pointed him out, saying he was a collaborator. He abused the population, and the officer on the spot gave them the order to execute him. And my grandfather's friend took his rifle off his shoulder and shot him in the head. And there's quite a bit that that episode tells us, one of which is that life was very cheap. And extrajudicial executions happened on a regular basis on both sides of the front. There was no jury. There was no trial. This was done immediately. And so that is what life was like.
Jan, thank you for sharing that, especially these deep family connections to this history. It obviously left such an impact on so many families and so many communities in this region. Jen, what would you like to add to this about the case of the Romanians?
Yeah, I mean, I think Jan covered it great. I would just add that the Romanian occupation expanded all the way down to the port of Odessa, and they occupied that region from October 1941 to the beginning of 1944. And in Odessa particularly, some historians have argued that it was a little bit more lenient than German occupation. This doesn't have anything to do with any compassion for the local population. It was more just inefficiency in administration. This area, Transnistria, was not incorporated into Romania, so they kind of had a joint local government and Romanian government, which was kind of just very ineffective in creating policies. And so in some instances, you have Ukrainians who are able to, especially with the murder of thousands of Jews, move up in society, which they say is a better than like the Germans, but at what cost? I feel like we should also add that. But yeah, there were some promises to Romania wanted to eventually annex this region if Nazi Germany won the war in the East. And so they were making some promises to end collectivization at some later time, but they never did because it ended up being too effective to produce food to feed the army. But yeah, it was a little bit different than German occupation, but not because they were more compassionate.
It's a really, I think, important point to remember that Marshal Antonescu, the dictator of Romania, was considered by Hitler to be one of his most reliable allies into the summer of 1944, when he's finally overthrown, and then Romania changes sides and sides with the Allies and declares war on Germany. But for some 3 years, it was, and actually beyond, it's a major contributor to the war in the Soviet Union, of course, a major supplier of oil to the German war effort well into 1944. I think our discussion's already pointed out, and we're kind of watching our time here. We're getting close to some 50 minutes already we've been at this. And what's become clear, I think, from both of you is just reminding us about the inseparability of the war in Ukraine from the Holocaust, that these are two aspects of the same phenomenon we're really dealing with here. And Jen, this is really for you. You've noted elsewhere that the Holocaust in Ukraine was distinct. So could you explain for our audience what you mean here by this kind of distinctiveness?
Sure. Yeah, and I think Jan's already pointed out some of the main features that make it distinct. I mean, on the one hand, you're not having people transported in trains to mass killing sites in Poland. They're not being killed in gas chambers that typically characterize the Holocaust in the minds of most public imagination. Instead, these Holocaust victims were literally like taken from their homes, usually transported by foot to the outskirts of cities, towns, and they were like brutally shot face to face in the back in forests, ravines, and often in the presence of local residents and non-Jewish neighbors as well. I mean, Jan's already mentioned the most famous mass shooting in Ukraine, which took place at Babi Yar, but this was not the only mass shooting. I mean, their estimates range between like 400 to 500 sites where the Holocaust by bullets took place, and the area is still being excavated to try and find more sites of mass execution. And in these smaller places, you may have only had like 100 victims shot and killed, but there are so many across Ukraine, and it was directly related to the invasion, as Jan has pointed out.
Yeah, I think it's worth mentioning here that two of the figures involved with these mobile German mass murder squads, the Einsatzgruppen, Paul Blobel from Einsatzgruppe C, and Otto Ohlendorf, who was the leader of Einsatzgruppe D, that both of them are among the last Nazis executed by the United States. That's actually in the summer of 1951, before they're put to death, had been tried in what was known as the Einsatzgruppen trial that had happened a few years earlier. So there's a long confrontation with the crimes connected to the Holocaust by bullets, a long and very difficult history. These next two questions really come to the issue of Ukrainian involvement in this. And some of this has been touched on already by Jan. So Jen, we'll start with you with this kind of two-part question about the agency, if you will, the involvement, the actions of Ukrainians on both sides of this conflict. There's been a long series of debates, Jen, about Ukrainian collaboration with the Nazis. Can you take us through this much contested aspect of the war? And then, Jan, I'll ask you, kind of following up on that, to say something about Ukrainian involvement in the Red Army. President Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, has talked very openly about the fact that his grandfather served in the Red Army and very proud of his service during World War II. So this current battle we're hearing all the time with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, where World War II was mobilized. This history is very much a part of that. So Jen, I'll start with you, the issue of collaboration, and then Jan with you about Ukrainians in the Red Army and also in Soviet partisan units.
Sure. Yeah. I think it's important to note that the term collaboration is not usually black and white in many cases, although there are some cases where it kind of is in Ukraine. They were definitely Ukrainians who actively worked with and supported the Nazi occupation of Ukraine. As Jan mentioned earlier, the main goal of this was to try and create an independent Ukrainian state allied with Nazi Germany, similar to Slovakia or Croatia. And the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, the OUN, is the main group that collaborated actively with Nazi Germany. And this organization, just like briefly, was founded in the 1920s, and their basic premise was to create an independent Ukrainian state at all costs. And this literally included, and is outlined in their Decalogue, included committing violence against those who didn't agree with their mission, and also it included eliminating ethnic and national minorities as well through violence. So in cooperation with Nazi Germany, the OUN militias were key participants in a lot of the anti-Jewish violence in the summer of 1941, as Jan had mentioned, during the initial invasion. The organization also recruited and infiltrated police formations that provided the manpower for these German mobile killing units in Ukraine. And they did so for their own political reasons. But again, they also hoped that their participation would allow for the creation of an independent Nazi allied state. When this didn't happen, and this is where some of like the mythology regarding the OUN comes into play, especially in Ukrainian nationalist mythology today, the OUN did end up fighting Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. But it's really important to say that even though they attempted to change their rhetoric, they were still actively killing Jews who were not initially liquidated. And then they also in 1943 famously committed ethnic cleansing against Poles in Volhynia. And so, I mean, even though that some Ukrainian I don't know, historians, not so much anymore, but in the past, like to mythicize the OUN as fighters against like Nazism and communism, that's not a very accurate description. And yes, they technically did, but they also committed atrocious crimes as well. And then just another thing to note, and this goes back to the gray areas of collaboration. There were Ukrainians who were coerced into working with local Nazi administrations and governments in occupied Ukraine. Some chose to work because they would receive extra food, or their family didn't have to send members to Germany to work in forced labor camps there. We could get into a whole discussion of whether that's collaboration, whether that's not, but those are some like the gray areas of collaboration that happened in Ukraine and other areas of Nazi occupied Eastern Europe.
Jen, thank you for that very nuanced description of this. Jan, what about Ukrainians in the Red Army and Soviet partisan units?
So I'll add very quickly onto what Jen said, just a few things, and she categorized it quite well. And absolutely, collaboration is not always a black and white affair. There's a lot of gray there. But those that did collaborate and cooperate, what we have to keep in mind is not only did they police villages, towns, districts, they also helped round up Jews, prevented them from escaping ghettos and execution sites, and sometimes, as mentioned, perform the executions themselves. Now, it's also interesting the way that Ukrainian nationalists have somewhat been able to get away with saying that they were not necessarily collaborators is because the relationship between the Germans and the nationalists soured rather quickly. So much so that by the end of November of 41, Einsatzgruppen had orders to kill Ukrainian nationalists in secret under the charge of looting. Right? By 42, the AUN was regarded as an illegal and anti-German organization. So this gives them some foundation to say that they were not collaborating with the Germans, even though they cannot erase that initial history of collaboration. And we also have to keep in mind that just because the Germans looked at them and treated them that way does not mean that in 1943, for instance, there weren't 80,000 volunteers for the 14th Waffen-SS Galicia division, right, of which 8,000 were eventually enlisted alongside those from various security forces, and then fought against the Red Army, and eventually surrendered to the British by claiming that they were Polish citizens, so that they were not turned over to the Soviets. And just to give some numbers very quickly, the AUN, O-U-N, eventually created their own army, UPA, right, Ukrainian Partisan Army, Povstanskaya Armia, numbered about 25 to 30,000. They could grouped in about 100 battalions, and they could additionally supposedly call up an additional 100,000 people to their ranks. And also mentioned were the genocidal campaigns against the Poles, and the numbers that I saw were 70 to 100,000 killed. However, in retaliation, Poles in predominantly Polish areas also committed genocide against Ukrainian minorities to the tune of 10 to 20,000. So again, not a black and white affair at all. Now, with respect to Ukrainians in the Red Army and in the Soviet partisan movement, numbers I'm seeing about 3 to 4 million Ukrainians served in the Red Army. Also keep in mind about 200,000 partisans operated in Ukraine at their peak under Soviet control, and undoubtedly the vast majority of them were Ukrainians. And unlike the Baltic states, which there was, for example, a division predominantly made up of Lithuanians, Estonians, Latvians here and there were no such units necessarily made up of predominantly Ukrainians in the Red Army. They were found everywhere. The Navy, in the Air Force, in the artillery arm, the tank forces, everywhere. Right, so their contribution cannot be denied. Now, the problem with Ukraine, as we've somewhat mentioned, I mean, there's many issues, but one of them is that there is this separation between East and West. And so those from the East undoubtedly had a much easier to find loyalty to the Soviet state as compared to Western Ukrainians. Right, so they would be more active, more vocal, more involved compared to their Western counterparts. And this very much is mirrored in the partisan movement, right? Again, as mentioned, Ukrainian nationalist partisans targeted literally everyone: Romanians, Germans, Soviets, Jews, Poles, other Ukrainians. Everyone could be and was an enemy depending on when and where we're talking about. And this makes it very hard to keep your head straight in terms of who the enemy is. And in part, I would say that this eventually leads to the downfall of this movement because they took out their aggression on their own at times, those they considered or perceived as traitors to their cause. I'll also mention that the partisan movement in the Soviet Union was somewhat split between two rather large groups in Belarus and in Ukraine. And there was a famous Rails War that took place later on in the war against the rear of the German occupying forces. And those in Belarus targeted German train tracks, while those in Ukraine targeted German trains. The latter was much more effective. Right. And so they had that as something of a prestige for themselves, that they actually, performed the partisan war correctly. And I will also finally say that some of the largest partisan groups could be found in Ukrainian territory. And we're talking about numbering in the thousands, practically divisional level at times, over 10,000. And they would move with the German rear as the Germans were in retreat. And so they went out of their original area of operation into as far as the Carpathian Mountains and helped liberate those areas as well. Otherwise, those that stayed behind would eventually be conscripted into the Red Army. And some preferred, honestly, the freedom and the lack of laws that the partisan movement represented. So take that for what you will.
It is really interesting to see a figure like Stepan Bandera. And Jen had been talking to us, both of you talked about the OUN, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, and the way he's remembered. in Ukraine versus in Russia, or even within Ukraine, how he's remembered. So we would encourage our viewers to look more into this about how a figure like Bandera has been remembered. We have about 10 minutes left, Jen and Jan. So I thought that we would do this, that Jan, asking maybe the impossible of you to just say a few things for our audience about the Soviet reconquest of Ukraine, even just giving them a kind of framing to think about that. And then to wrap up, hearing from each of you about what you think the legacy of the German-Soviet war in Ukraine, what should we take from this, you think? I know those are very difficult questions to cram into such a short time, but we want to try it here as time is slipping away from us. So Jan, just something about the Soviets retaking Ukraine, and then hearing from both of you about the legacy of this incredibly brutal war between Hitler and Stalin in Ukraine.
So very quick kind of bullet points. The liberation of Ukraine begins in the late summer of 43 in the aftermath of the Battle of Kursk. Initially, you've got the Belgorod-Kharkov offensive taking place, with Kharkov being liberated in August of 43. Ensuing operations include the liberation of the Donbass, Kiev, crossing of the Dnieper in late 1943. And I think this is one of the most significant operations that doesn't get enough attention, as the Red Army suffers hundreds of thousands of casualties trying to get through this body of water. And I believe the first ones to get across were wholesale awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union Gold Star, which was not easy to get. Eventually, you have the Germans retreating from Ukrainian territory, leaving behind weapons caches for Ukrainian nationalists to utilize in the continuing fight against Soviet forces. So they thought of this as a very small investment that they hoped would pay dividends in helping slow down the Red Army's advance. As the Red Army moves through Ukraine, they begin to liberate towns, cities, villages, and incorporate men of military age into their units, about 700,000 total. This goes back in part to 1941 and 42, and that is, in quite a few instances, Ukrainian prisoners of war were let go by the Germans, or their release was bargained by locals through bartering. And so this, in part, is where you get this rather large and significant figure. Not all, but definitely a part of them were pretty much just back home trying to live their lives. And here they were incorporated into the Red Army. And in part, they were also incorporated into the Red Army, obviously, because that there is a manpower situation, but also because they wanted to keep them out of Ukrainian nationalist hands. And the easiest way was keeping in the ranks of the Red Army. That doesn't necessarily mean that they got all the training they needed. Sometimes, unfortunately, because of the speed of the advance, they were not even given uniforms, and they pretty much died on the front lines very quickly, at times without being reported as being part of units. And this honestly goes to this issue that we have with not really knowing the full extent of Soviet casualties, be it 1941 or as late as 1943, 44. Incorporating all these people into Red Army ranks, similarly, amnesties were offered by the Soviets to those who came over to Soviet partisan groups from German security forces. This inevitably increased anti-Semitism among both partisan ranks and the Red Army, because these men, sometimes women, were exposed to quite a bit of Nazi rhetoric about Jews, etc., and they brought those ideas with them. Ukrainian nationalists continue to operate, and unfortunately, one of the most famous victims is General Nikolai Vatutin, one of the more gifted and talented Soviet commanders who died due to injuries sustained from a Ukrainian nationalist partisan ambush on February 28th, 1944. So they are taking a significant toll on Soviet forces. And as I mentioned, due to the fluid nature of events, targets for Ukrainian nationalists could feature anyone and everyone. Now, for the civilian population, we've got to keep in mind everything that they were experiencing. Millions, as mentioned, become foreign laborers in Germany. Tens of thousands joined German security services and the Wehrmacht in its war against Jews, partisans, and the Red Army. Hundreds of thousands participated in the Soviet partisan movement. millions in the Red Army. Women and children were made to make devastating choices about whom to support and when. And through these variety of scenarios that they often had to go through, they paid the price, not only for their own decisions with their own agency, but for those of the family members and friends sometimes, as Soviets, the Germans, and Ukrainian nationalists regularly targeted those supporting or abetting perceived or actual enemies. So all of this is taking place as the Red Army liberates Ukrainian territory. And, I'll put liberates in quotes in this case, because for some, undoubtedly, it was liberation, but for others, it was exchanging one set of unlivable circumstances for another.
That's terrific, and really kind of, pointing out to us that there's no kind of seamless end of the war in Ukraine, like where the Germans are pushed out and then it's over. That this is a very complicated history. For some, it was liberation. For others, it was a new occupation. That it's a very complicated and history just fraught with enormous suffering and death. That said, Jen, I'd like to start with you and kind of wrapping up here, your thoughts about the legacies of this war in Ukraine, and then we'll finish with Jan.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the most immediate legacy is the utter destruction of not just physical destruction, but also, the 1.6 million Jews that were murdered in Ukraine, and I don't know the number of civilians that were murdered by the Nazi regime. You also do have, which we haven't mentioned yet, a lot of, close to 500,000 Ukrainian forced laborers that try to stay in Germany and Austria after the war. I think about 250,000 actually succeed in that. And it caused a great migration to the United States and Canada. Jan mentioned his grandparents earlier. My grandparents were forced laborers, and they were ones who were able to migrate to the United States. And I think also to, just to mention the rhetoric that's being used by Russia and Ukraine today really brings, the history of what happened in Ukraine during World War II to the forefront. You see Russia and Ukrainians both using World War II language to describe a situation which, the adjectives are not not accurate, and they shouldn't be used. But hopefully this webinar kind of clears up some of those misconceptions that we're seeing in some propaganda on both sides.
So
thank you. Jan, please.
I think, as you mentioned, Jason, that the end of the war was not necessarily the end of the war, right? In the immediate aftermath, you've got a famine that hits Ukraine, 800,000 to 1 million people die. By 1950, you have this influx of almost 2 million forced laborers who come back to Ukraine. You have a large population exchange between Poland and Ukraine to the tune of hundreds of thousands being forcefully relocated. And then you also have public trials of collaborators. That takes place until about 47, when they begin to be held behind closed doors to give the impression that the war effort was a united affair and that collaborators did not represent any type of significant portion of the population. But those trials continue into the late 1980s. My grandfather on my mother's side was witness to one of them in the city of Chernovtsi, right? In general, I will say that I think aside from those very physical and easy to point to legacies, there are a lot of myths and legends that have formed around this war on all sides. And the one thing that I want to say often gets overlooked, because much of what we discussed today was undoubtedly deserved our attention, but it was bad, horrible, and tragic and traumatic. But we do not necessarily touch on all those who were altruistic in their actions, but by the thousands saving Jews successfully, right? Putting their lives on the line. And so in present day, modern day Ukraine, you have this fascination with figures like Stepan Bandera. In my opinion, it would be better served for not just Ukraine, but for others who look at their legacy of the Second World War, to look toward those people that were more altruistic in their actions and put their lives on the line, knowing what the outcome would be, and not someone like Stepan Bandera, who spent the majority of the war not being located in Ukraine, and rather located in a variety of, honestly, prisons and concentration camps, but with somewhat easy enough jobs that he would survive. And so I think the legacy needs to be that we have to rethink who we look toward as figures to emulate. Right.
Well, let me say, on behalf of the National World War II Museum and the museum's Institute for the Study of War and Democracy, we really appreciate, Jen, you and Jan marshaling your expertise for us today. We've covered a lot, I think, and I think we have really shed some light on the history of World War II in Ukraine, and hopefully will spark other discussions that maintain this level of historical accuracy and integrity. So thanks to you both very much for that. And for those who have watched this webinar, we also value you and your time and interest, and hope you will check out our website and YouTube channel for our other programming, and look forward to seeing you or being in contact with you in the future. Thank you very much.